Hi, I'm Andy Cowan, the only comedy writer associated with Cheers, Seinfeld, and Third Rock from the Sun, and a performer, and the author of the new book, Banging My Head Against the Wall, A Comedy Writer's Guide to Seeing Stars, with foreword by Jay Leno. And you're watching Mr. Media.
Banging My Head Against the Wall, A Comedy Writer's Guide to Seeing Stars is a great book title because it's not only clever, it tells you exactly what the book is about. Humorist Andy Cowan's career has known great highs, as captured in the book's subtitle, and great frustrations, as telegraphed in the title. It also gets across the concept of opposites, which could be said to capsulize his work life ever since he conceived of The Opposite episode of Seinfeld. Cowan's early career in TV was spent as talent coordinator for the Merv Griffin show. And yes, I know more than a few of you don't even know who Merv Griffin is anymore. But he was a prominent force in late-night television for many years, attracting the biggest names in show business during his time, many of whom were pre-interviewed by Cowan. But Cowan's ambitions were bigger than Merv. He wanted to write television sitcoms. In his off hours, he wrote spec scripts for shows such as the Mary Tyler Moore Show spinoff Phyllis and Cheers. He also eventually wrote for Third Rock from the Sun and Seinfeld. He had a great deal of success, eventually, but there was a whole lot of waiting and rejection in between. Sorry. Although he once scammed Lorne Michaels into a Saturday Night Live tryout, his big break came when Larry David, co-creator of Seinfeld, liked one of his ideas and eventually brought him on staff beginning in the show's 6th season. We'll talk about that and a whole lot more today. Andy Cowan, welcome to Mr. Media.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bob.
Excuse me while I have something to sip on before I cough to death.
I wouldn't want that on my watch.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't. Sorry about that. So, Andy, let's start with the most basic question. Jerry Seinfeld or Larry David?
Well, I think I may have related more with Larry David's persona, the neurotic aspect of it. In fact, I once rationalized in a semi-humorous way as to why I didn't last longer there. I wondered if maybe I reminded him of the man in the mirror. You've heard of familiarity breeds contempt. Not that I'm implying I'm the genius Larry is. I'm my own genius. But I did sense the same angst and analysis of the neurotic, screwed up things in life through his very intelligent perspectives. I could really relate with that angst. And Jerry was such a grounded, he seemed so grounded and well-adjusted, especially since he was in he was the core of that show, and I was there, was number one, and he's the star and co-creator and co-EP, and boy, he really handled it like a dream. It didn't at least look as if he was as angst-ridden as I could sense Larry might be in certain aspects of his life. Not that he wasn't very confident of what he was doing, because he certainly was, but I could relate with the neuroses. So my long-winded answer to your question was, I guess I could connect more with Larry David's persona.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to Seinfeld in a few minutes. There is a lot of frustration in the title of your book, I think, and it kind of oozes from a lot of the pages. But you also had a great succession of great moments. So I wondered, which outweighs the other, the frustration or the successes?
Well, the frustrations in terms of mileage I can get from it in terms of comedy, because there's always humor in suffering. And certainly I am Charlie Brown running for the football for 40 years, and showbiz is sweeping the football away oftentimes. But looking back, another analogy is it's almost kind of like It's a Wonderful Life. I look at this book and think, wow, I did contribute something, and I'm still contributing. And that's one of the messages of the book. The reader takes the journey with me and sees what it's like, not only working on these iconic shows and interviewing these iconic celebrities and performing live on television, and the strategies that go in it, and the pitching to the industry and the reactions back and everything else. So there's a lot to learn in an enjoyable way, I think, in this book. But there's an uplifting message at the end of the book that you have to do the opposite of get knocked down, and as cliched as it sounds, get back up and not attach any more importance to a particular pothole in life as it deserves. It's a snapshot in time. You move on from there. And right now, I'm more excited than ever about several creative projects looming, both in the way of a comedy docuseries in which I'm the lead, and I co-created with Rich Ross, a friend and fellow reality comedy maven. We've had interest from David Steinberg, among others, and there's a feature project that a friend of mine, Ted Collins, who I've worked with before on an award-winning short, he wants to make now. So, I mean, you never know. You always just keep taking those swings, and I think I'm more up than down, even though there's a chapter in the book, as readers will see, called Up and Down Guys, which was a whole other passion project of mine that I did on the radio and the web.
Well, of course, when you title your book "Banging My Head Against the Wall," the sense would be that there's a lot of frustration that stays with you, I guess. It sounds like there's a bit of a balance that you have to kind
of. Absolutely. I mean, I think earlier on I had a slightly thinner skin than I do now, because you really develop an immunity to all the BS. And there's a chapter in the book called "The Opposite of Holding Back," where I tell some of the decision makers off. It's a very therapeutic chapter. I think the readers will get a kick out of just in terms of the insanity you have to deal with, and the BS, to repeat that again, from the decision makers who are in the catbird seat deciding what America watches. And it's so arbitrary and based on so many things other than the merits of a project. That's why one of the testimonials I got was very gratifying, from Dan Ferraro, a brilliant artist who created Bizarro, a comic strip that I wrote 300 panels for. And as he says in his testimonial, this book shows that the arbiters of what gets on the air don't necessarily represent a meritocracy. After you look at the wealth of projects in this book, original projects that the reader can enjoy from the ground up, to see how comedy is shaped and excerpted and pitched, and it's a fun education. I call the Merv Griffin show early on Showbiz University, which it was, but this book is Showbiz University in a lot of ways.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Merv, and we'll kind of work our way forward. As I mentioned, I think I've indicated, I'm old enough to have seen that show in its time when it was on nightly. My wife and I actually honeymooned at Merv Griffin Resort, the Ocean Club, Paradise Island in the Bahamas. But what I want to know is, as someone who actually worked with Merv day in and day out, who was Merv to you, and what do you want people to know about, what should his legacy be to people who, may not know him?
Well, he was so relaxed on camera. He was such a nice guy. I mean, that was one of the reasons Jay Leno did the foreword and talked about him in the book. As he said, nobody had an unkind word to say about Merv behind the scenes. He was very supportive. I mean, I was on the show. I started as a talent coordinator at age 29. And a year later, I made my premiere on the show as a comedy performer. I was on 5 times. And that in and of itself was so supportive and thrilling and scary, which I talk about in the book. But he really did keep his eyes peeled for up and coming talent. I mean, he was a champion early on of Richard Pryor, which was, long before I got there in the 60s. But I used to watch the show back then in junior high. And as Jay Leno says in the foreword, he really kind of gets undersold in terms of what he brought to the comedy world, and how he championed those new artists, and how it was also more fun, perhaps, on his show than the tension that was associated with the likes of the Tonight Show. He was a fun guy, and he was great at selling the conviction of the intros that he would read. We'd write for him leading up to the guests, and then he'd absorb those transcripts of areas and questions that we'd asked the guests prior in such a way. He'd go out there and he would make the interviews his own, as if he remembered everything. His mind was like a steel trap, and he'd lean into the guest with such penetration that you figured, well, if he's as interested in the guest as he appears to be, I guess I should be too. So he brought a lot to the equation that people forgot about. He was certainly one of the talk show pioneers.
And since we can't have Merv here with us today, I'm wondering, can you still do your Merv Griffin impression?
I sure can.
Yeah.
I used to do it in stand-up, and in fact, I set a recording of it in my packet to hopefully eventually get a job there. And one of the first days I met him, I did the Merv impression, but I didn't have the guts to face him. So I turned around, and this is what I did. And it'll have a slightly dated reference at the end, or maybe I'll explain the reasoning behind the reference before I give it back. Okay, here we go. One of Hollywood's most handsome leading men is with us today, and one of its all-time competent actors. TV fans know him as not only a classic entertainer, but also an exceptional talent. He does it all and always with great style. Cal Worthington is with us. So yeah, in other words, you take a beat and you inject some schlocky name at the end that doesn't merit the big buildup leading up to it. Oh, and I forgot my tongue in between my teeth. I used to do that a lot. But yeah, I didn't have the nerve to face him, so I turned around and did it for him. But he gave me that Merv laugh.
Yeah, because I was waiting to see who the actor was you were going to mention, and I'm thinking, could be anyone. And of course, it's somebody who less well remembered even than Merv Griffin himself.
I know. We need to update that punchline. Who would be the obscure reference today? Besides yours truly, I guess.
Wow.
Not after this book gets out there. I'll tell you that much.
So, and in the book, you spend a lot of time kind of recalling your encounters with Merv's guests, who obviously you spent a lot of time with. Can you tell people a little bit about who impressed you and who maybe not so much?
Yeah, well, certainly Orson Welles. I was always assigned him. I interviewed him 8 times leading up to his final appearance on the show, which was the day before he died. And a lot of his quotes about age, he had just turned 70, which seems so young now, but he was bemoaning turning 70, and his quotes, what Charles de Gaulle said, old age is a shipwreck, and Merv was careful to lead him to those areas, and made the wire services, shortly thereafter when he died. And he was really an imposing figure. But he was, ironically, one of the guests who would always ask me, what do you think? He'd ask my opinion, which was really intimidating. Wow, Orson Welles was asking my opinion. So he was very memorable. I interviewed Andy Kaufman. He was a character. He always wanted Merv to shake things up, and the more questions Merv could ask about his wrestling and how women were angry and who this Tony Clifton guy was, and he'd protest. Well, I wasn't here when Tony was here. Meanwhile, it was the same person. And he had this anecdote about his still wanting to remain connected to the working roots outside of show business. So he occasionally worked a day job at Jerry's Deli, just serving people behind the counter. And he asked people, do you want coffee? And they'd say, yeah. He said, do you want regular coffee or Jerry's special brew? And they'd go, "Ooh, Jerry's special brew. What's in that?" A special ingredient. So, "Ooh, I'd like that." So he'd come over with 2 pots of coffee with the same coffee in each pot. So he was an offbeat guy, that's for sure. But let's see who else. Oh, so many people. One of my Laurence Olivier, I talk about in the book. I picked him up in a limousine, and readers can read about what happened when I asked him to sign his galleys to me and Merv's cousin Charlie Haig, who worked on Hill Street Blues, grabbed the book and said, "Oh, sign it to Merv," and I was crushed. But Olivier had a solution that readers can read about in the book. But one of my most memorable, in a bad way, interviews was with Ethel Merman, the great Broadway star. For some reason, nobody told me why she was going to be on the show. So I instinctively, remembering her Brooklyn roots, even dropped the G in my "what's been happening?" And I said, "What's been happening, Ms. Merman? Catch me up." "What? You don't know about my concert in Carnegie Hall? Oh, my God." Oh, she rubbed my nose in it. Clyde Barnes wrote me a love letter in the New York Post. And it went on and on and on. So I tried to get her back on track, answering other questions that could fill out the interview. And it was quite a challenge. But
there are guests like that. I had one of those here several years ago. There was a guy who was a second or third tier actor on, well, I better not say the name of the show, but it was an NBC drama, and he couldn't believe that I had not watched the previous night's episode and knew about his big moment, and I was just like, "I'm sorry," and he got so upset. And I didn't watch the show to begin with, but I had watched a couple episodes before, but I didn't think to watch the, oh boy.
Yeah, I have a life. Sorry.
Yeah, I just, wow. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Charles Hayde, and I wanted to ask you about that. I don't think I knew that Charles Hayde, who played Renko, I believe, on Hill Street Blues,
that's right,
was Merv's cousin. I mean, what kind of super trivia moment is that?
That doesn't even make it on Jeopardy. I mean, that's too obscure for the final round.
I guess.
Yeah.
Was that pretty well known, though, at the time that they were related?
Not hugely well known, I don't believe. But he was sucking up the oxygen with Laurence Olivier, because the actor's actor. What actor doesn't want to be around the actor's actor? So that was really cool, picking him up. I met Jimmy Carter on the show, and interviewed Henry Kissinger, and all kinds of folks. And I have this morbid habit of, when they die all these years later, I clip their obit and tape it to the interview in my entire bookshelf of interviews that I've saved during my years at the Griffin show. So I don't know why I keep doing that, but I figure some long lost descendant of mine may appreciate it.
Well, that was something I wondered about. In the book, you have a page or two devoted to each of these really significant people that you pre-interviewed for the show. Mm-hmm. Did you take notes at the time? Is that where was that information coming from? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I took rigorous notes and typed them up on the old IBM Selectric, questions and answers, kind of leading Merv into chunks or hunks, and then we'd meet with him 1 or 2 times a day. Sometimes he was doing 2 shows a day, and God, he'd just read a slew of them before the show, and they'd just be absorbed, and out he'd go. And God, he must have been great cramming for exams as a kid, because to remember all that stuff and then make it his own was really impressive.
Well, what I find impressive as a writer who interviews a lot of people, that you had the sense in whatever years we're talking about, 70s, 80s.
No, don't make me older than I am.
Okay, in the 80s.
81 to 86.
Okay, so in that period of time, pre-internet, that you saved all this stuff.
I know, that's right. I'm sorry. Yeah, we weren't able to Google information on these people. Everything was cut and paste, and God, I don't know how we got along without all that stuff.
Well, I can put that in my own perspective. During that same period, I was a music critic for the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Tribune,
Mm-hmm.
and did a lot of phone interviews with people, Ella Fitzgerald and Carl Perkins. I mean, people, very prominent for the ages, frankly, and kept all the tapes. Unfortunately, I wish that I had just typed it up at the time, because a lot of the tapes didn't survive. All those great Maxell ads. I'm sorry, TDK. Sorry.
Speaking of Ella,
the
wasn't
product
she featured
exactly
in one of those Maxell?
Exactly. The products over time were crap. The Radio Shack tapes, however, which were like 25 cents, they survived. So I just
That
like
is weird.
Yeah, and so anyway,
Those tapes with cockroaches crawling all over them are the last survivors.
There you go. There you go. So I appreciate just, one person to another who's done a lot of interviewing, that you saved all that and could share that. So I was curious about that. By the way, I got to go back to Charles Haid for just a second. It's interesting to me that he was eating up the oxygen in the room with you and Laurence Olivier, Sir Laurence, but he didn't ask that Olivier sign the galleys to himself. He wanted it signed to Merv. And we won't go into how that story ends, but I thought that was interesting, because if it would have been me, cousin or not, I would say, could you sign it to Charles?
That shines kindly on Charlie.
I mean, looking out for his cousin, I guess.
Yeah.
Who, now it was. One other bit of interesting trivia that comes from your book about Merv, and that is his producer. Tell people who the producer of the Merv Griffin show was.
Oh, well, Peter Barsacchini.
Well, no, it's not. Well, there was somebody else I was thinking of. Somebody's brother.
Director Dick Carson.
I'm sorry.
Right, Johnny's brother. Oh yeah, he was such a cool guy, and he directed all 5 of my comedy bits on the show, which was a thrill. He wound up telling Ed McMahon, who was one of my guests, about one of my bits that I did on the show. It was such a kick, but he was such a cool, consummate professional, and I know Merv got a kick out of the fact that Johnny's brother, of all people, was directing his show. But he was a real pro, Dick Carson.
It's just, talk about trivia. I mean, that's one of those little notes that's been kind of lost to time, but I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, okay, wait, one more bit of trivia, and then we'll move on from this.
Yeah.
And that is, you point out that when Merv finally ended his show,
mm-hmm.
Where was the first place he went after ending his own show?
He went to Johnny. Yep, Johnny had him on the show, and I remember that well. Yeah, that was in Johnny's monologue that night. That was one of the times of many that Johnny poked fun at Merv's theme shows. He had another one of those that only Merv can do with such panache. I think that's what Johnny would always say. And then he'd string together a bunch of guests and make a joke out of the seeming symmetry of it. But he had Merv on that night.
And the competition then was different than it has been over the years. In that time, I remember. I guess I picked up some of this from there's a show called the Carson Podcast where they interview people about the Carson show, and a lot of the writers who wound up on Dick Cavett left Carson to go to Cavett, and Carson was pretty understanding about that. Unlike the period when Leno took over for Carson, and it was all out war between Carson and Letterman, we're now into a friendlier time when the Jimmys and Stephen Colbert are friendly with one another, and it's come full circle again.
That is interesting.
We don't have
it's almost
quite that
like
animus.
World late night leaders are getting along. Maybe thematically that will speak to the world leaders in politics getting along. But
I doubt it.
I doubt that. If Kim Jong can get along with the Donald, anything's possible, I guess.
One dictator to another.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was while working for Merv that you met a number of comedians, one of which you wound up working for, Jerry Seinfeld. Do you remember your first impressions of him? And when you joined the show eventually, did he have any memory of?
Yeah, he did. There were three incarnations of Jerry in my life. Initially, I had met him on a stand-up gig. I think it was at UCLA. College audiences tended to be my crowd, and I had a good set. I felt really good. And then this kid comes up and starts, "What is head cheese?" And he's talking about all this stuff, and I'd never seen anybody quite like him. Just the confidence that the guy had for his young age in particular. And I was blown away. The crowd was blown away. And I walked up to him and said, "Wow, did you ever think of doing Carson?" He said, "Oh, I'm not ready yet." I think this was about 1980. And then about a year and a half later, I began interviewing him on the Merv Griffin show multiple times. And then years later, I wound up on Seinfeld. So it was three separate chapters having to do with Jerry. It was kind of unusual in that way.
His sitcom was such a big success that a lot of people who didn't encounter him until then only know that, he's still out doing stand-up now. But the fact of the matter is, when he got the sitcom, he was pretty much the biggest thing on the stand-up circuit. There may have been people who were maybe more popular or more topical, whose lines were bigger, but no one outdrew him. He just drew so many people for so many years, and then people forget about that now that he's such a sitcom legend.
Mm-hmm. And of course he was doing his 6-minute hunks on the talk shows and Johnny's for many years leading up to the show. And when he got that A-OK from Johnny, that's when his career kicked into hyperdrive, and that's when eventually NBC had their eye on him to do a pilot that wound up limping along in the beginning until they gave it another shot and let it live and breathe and find an audience, which is rarer these days, that's for sure.
I love the story of one of your ideas once you make connection with the Seinfeld show, but before you're on staff. You had this idea I thought was so funny, and it just and maybe you want to tell it. It's about the George finds a lost bra.
Oh, sure. Well, that was one of the initial stories I pitched Larry before I pitched him as a last-ditch effort, the opposite, which he immediately went for. But he was going to do this lost bra one. The pitch being, George finds this gigantic bra in the dryer doing a wash, and it's almost like Prince Charming finding the glass slipper. He wants to find out who this fits. And of course, others disabuse him of the notion that it's some sexy woman who's the owner, like Kramer. Oh, it's a grandmother's bra. Don't be ridiculous. Look at the lace on it. Forget it. So that was a real funny pitch. I always wanted to do that. And then ultimately he passed on it because, we're doing another bra episode this season. But you got anything else? Another bra. So I threw him this opposite thing because I always used to think, what if I had done the complete opposite of whatever I've done up till now? I'm sure I would have been better off. And he immediately saw something in that, and I wound up cobbling that together with 3 other stories. He eventually approved, and I went off and wrote it, and it became the big finale. And to this day, as I mentioned in the book, it's quoted in all walks of life. Wall Street Journal had a piece in 2018 about invest like George did with the opposite. Art, economics, politics, Trump's rise in many ways on CNN, and by Michael Smerconish, who is in the book, XM Sirius CNN, talks about he was the opposite candidate. So it's amazing how life imitates art all these years later based on that premise. So I'm kind of proud of that.
I would think so, and people know that. There's certain touchstones in the history of that show, and the opposite is one.
And Bob, if I may say about the opposite, it's one of the themes throughout the book, not only in terms of twists and turns in life, in my life, in show business, and also in comedy. That principle can be applied in many respects. For example, I was mentioning the Bizarro panel that I wrote some 300 panels with Dan Ferraro.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them applied the principle of the opposite, like the woman bemoaning to her miffed husband, "Yes, I cheated on your twin." I know, I get it right. "Yes, I cheated on you with your twin, but I thought I was cheating on him with you." Or the kid in science class holding an alligator. "My homework ate my dog." So you do the switch, and it's amazing how many times the opposite. The devil is sitting in the waiting room, and the doctor comes out. "I'm afraid I have some good news." It's incredible how the opposite can oftentimes be applied in comedic situations.
One of the things that it was interesting, there's a lot of interesting things in the book, obviously, I keep referencing, but you actually got a written letter of compliment from Larry David. That's got to sit pretty well with a fellow.
Now I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember my own past here. A written letter of compliment.
Well, you got a letter from Larry. I think it's reprinted in the book, where he compliments you on. Now, I don't have a physical copy of the book, so I can't.
Oh, you mean when he's referencing at that Writers Guild meeting about Andy Cowan's? It was Andy Cowan's idea about the opposite, and then
is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah. That was a transcript that somebody made me aware of years later. It was a Writers Guild confab, I believe, and he was speaking, and somebody asked him, "How? I love the opposite. How'd that idea come about?" And he credited me with it, which I was really, gratified to hear. And so I cite, I think, a reference to that in the book. That might be what you're.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought you were going to mention the Don Hewitt letter, which was a letter that was there was a
about your 6 Minutes parody.
Yeah. I speaking of the opposite, making lemonade out of lemons. I had been turned down for this project that I produced for the Pat Sajak show, on which I was a writer at the time, thinking they'd use the hunk. It was 6 Minutes. It was a CBS show. How can they not do it? It's a funny send-up of 60 Minutes. I play all the parts, Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, whatever. And they passed on it. And as bummed as I was, I cold called Showtime and Bravo and PBS and the Movie Channel. They all ran it as interstitial programming. And I get nominated for a Cable Ace Award for Showtime, and I win Best Short Form Programming Special. And Don Hewitt, the creator of 60 Minutes, that iconic guy who orchestrated the Kennedy-Nixon debate, sends me a great letter saying everybody loved 6 Minutes. I won't cite the specifics. You can see in the book because there's a little profanity in a funny way there. But yeah, it was such a cool ultimate reward to have his approval.
I think the last thing I want to ask you about Seinfeld. Tell me if I got this wrong, but you were almost the voice of George Steinbrenner. Oh,
absolutely, yeah. Because Larry was aware that I did voiceovers, and he said, "You want to do it? You want to try doing it?" So I studied George. In fact, you can see in the book a YouTube link to my actual audition that I sent him. And I just tried to nail Steinbrenner's voice because, I have been good with impressions over the years. And but Larry wound up doing it at Jerry's suggestion. "Why don't you do it? Why don't you do it?" And so, of course, Larry brought his own hysterical take to it, where you see the back of the guy's head. But so that was a kick to at least get to do it. But I did do some voiceover work on one of the episodes. I shared about a half a minute screen time with Julia Louis-Dreyfus as the DJ when Mr. Pitt wanted to hold a Woody Woodpecker balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. But the other kick about
there's a cautionary tale for you.
Oh yeah, that's right. I like to say, speaking of reboot fever and everybody being nostalgic for iconic shows from the 80s and 90s, readers will read quote unquote new Seinfeld stories that I pitched while I was on the show that never made it to air. So there are dozens of new Seinfeld episodes, as it were, that they can get a taste of, including a little snippet of my first draft of The Opposite, which I wound up performing years later on my talk show pilot of I as the host playing Jerry, and Jason Alexander, my guest, playing George. So that was a real kick.
Now, you mentioned Dan Ferraro, the creator of the Bizarro, the panel comic strip, and I wanted to ask you about that. Also, I have an interest in that because I'm friendly with Chris Brown, his father-in-law, who does Hagar the Horrible.
Oh, sure.
But you did 300 panels of that strip that you wrote. But I'm wondering, and then you also over the years have tried your hand at other strips. You've co-created several, and I'm wondering what's the for a guy that's written for sitcoms, what's the attraction of the comic strip format?
Well, that was one of my earliest, if not the earliest, creative outlet for me as a kid. You get to be king of your own universe. You're casting, you're writing, you're performing in a weird way. I drew my initial comic strips that wound up becoming an animated pilot, and then later a live action script. The readers can read about the various journeys there. It got very close to syndication, and then I created another comic strip with a great artist that got a lot of interest. But people can sample it in the book. But I loved just having control over this little world of creativity. It was very gratifying. I wish it were a more viable means to creativity these days, especially with print being on life support. I'm sorry, but there are all kinds of cartoons. There's a whole chapter on cartoons. I got a cartoon in the New Yorker with a great artist, Harry Bliss, and then I get to bash the New Yorker with a Bizarro that I was boldly proud to get out there. You want me to convey that one?
Sure.
It's where the doctor is asking the patient, you feel funny as in strange and difficult to explain, or as in a New Yorker cartoon? Patient goes, what's the difference?
Touche.
Yes.
All right, so we've touched on some highlights of your career. We've skipped around a little bit. There's so much more we could have talked about, obviously, but I know you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing today. So before we wrap up, you want to tell folks, what you're focused on now and what you're working on?
Yeah, and the readers can read about all the many creative projects, half-hour sketch, all kinds of other original projects in the book. But the journey of the book has led to this project in particular that I'm really excited about. It's a comedic but very honest docu-series about therapy, and it's my character in a therapy session. Very creative and visually relayed. I won't spill all the beans about what it is in that respect, but with music and field pieces that call back to what's broached on in therapy, connecting myself stuck in the 20th century world with the 21st century world and trying to eke out therapy wherever I can get it. That's the project that so many people have circled. David Steinberg wants to meet yet again. We've met with him 7 times about it, the comedy veteran, director. And we got great responses from Larry Charles and so many people, Dr. Drew. And I'm really excited about it. I really think it's a show that I was meant to do. And then this other feature project, which I relay in the book, Bradley Cooper's people were interested in, and that wound up derailing for no particular reason. But the update is that Ted Collins, who I worked with on an award-winning short, he's a Slamdance award-winning producer, wants to direct and produce this movie next year. So those are 2 projects I'm very excited about. Now I'm working with a great guy, Tim Sabian, who was with Westwood One and Howard Stern.
Sure.
Yeah, for years and years. Great guy. And he wants to get together with me on a podcast that I would be doing. So I feel strangely optimistic. I always talk about the other shoe about to drop. So I'm hopeful that the shoe is not going to be dropping right away. I'm pretty upbeat. And I hope the readers take that message ultimately from the book, along with a lot of the comedy, because there's a ton of that.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, folks, listen, you can find Andy Cowan's new memoir, Banging My Head Against the Wall, A Comedy Writer's Guide to Seeing Stars, in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. If you are watching the show on the main website, you'll see the cover of the book somewhere below the video. You can click on it right now, even while I'm talking, and you can download it as an ebook, or you can get it as a physical book. Either way, momentarily. You can have it that fast. So do that. Andy, is there a website? Are you on Twitter, Facebook? Where do you want people to find you?
My website is www.andycowan.net. And you can get information on links to the book via Amazon, and an email address if you want to contact me. And I'm also on Facebook, but I think the website would be the way to go.
Perfect. All right. Well, Andy, a pleasure reading the book, talking to you today, and good luck with whatever. Hopefully there'll be less banging your head against the wall in the future. And thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thank you so much, Bob. My pleasure.
To believe her, a bad idea to believe her.